You're listening to the Coast Business Radio podcast.
The Epoch Times is one of the largest independent Chinese language news media groups in the world. Founded in the US in 2000 in response to communist repression and censorship in China, they are free from the influence of government, corporations and political parties. The Epoch Times media network currently covers 21 languages and 33 countries. Its global headquarters is in New York City. Daniel Teng is a director of the Epoch Times and has been with the Epoch Times since 2011. He is a regular contributor to the editorial team on China-related issues. Daniel, nice to meet you.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
The Epoch Times has run a very strong editorial to resist the Chinese Communist Party virus, say no to the CCP. It says, amongst other things, that for nearly 40 years, the CCP has used globalization and economic incentives to bring other countries under the Communist Party's influence. CCP infiltration beyond China's borders run deep in the political, economic, cultural and educational spheres. Overt examples of People's Republic of China influence include the Confucius Institute's programs, the Belt and Road Initiative and telecom giant Huawei. By trapping people and governments within its system of economic interest, the Chinese Communist Party leads them to accommodate its atheist ideology, tolerate its tyrannical rule and betray the divine. Now, you're not a fan of the Chinese regime, are you?
Well, I guess at the end of the day, where our mission statement is focused on exposing the truth around the situations involving the Chinese Communist Party. Now, despite nowadays the discourse around Chinese Communist Party is very overt. People talk actively and openly about its use of hostility. But 10 years ago or 20 years ago when we started, this discussion around the communist regime was rather muted. And we put it down to really just, it's that old adage, the love of money is the root of all evil. The communist regime has tremendous economically across companies, businesses, organizations, and countries around the world. But the side effect of that was really that there was very little discussion, and especially when human rights abuses were occurring. So I guess what we're doing is really keen, for all these years, is really keen to just let people know more about what it really is, what it's trying to do around the world. And the series you just highlighted there, To Resist the Chinese Communist Party Virus, Say No to the CCP, is really just the latest in a series of editorial pieces we've put out, targeting and talking about the communist regime.
In a few weeks' time, Victoria is to sign an investment roadmap which ties the state to the communist giant. What are your thoughts on the Victorian government signing onto the Belt and Road Initiative and loans in the billions of dollars?
Yeah, it's certainly a very interesting situation. Like we obviously, the Victorian government will have to make their own decisions and their assessments, but in our experience and our studies on the Belt and Road, it's whenever you do a deal with the Chinese Communist regime, it isn't, there are strings attached. It's not like what Pinocchio says, that there are no strings on me. There are very much strings attached. And there are already existing case studies around the world from countries such as Sri Lanka, Sierra Leone in West Africa, Djibouti in Africa, who have engaged in the Belt and Road with the Chinese regime. And what have they found is that after, at the beginning it sounds really good. The Chinese regime promises funding for major infrastructure projects. But at the end of the day, a lot of these countries end up not being able to pay back the actual funding. And so the project itself reverts to Chinese ownership. Now, the issue with the Belt and Road in Victoria, and it's been criticized as well by federal politicians from both, from Labor and Liberal, is that there's just very little transparency around the actual agreements. And when you look at the agreements Victorian government has signed with China, I think the first agreement is just 4 pages, and the second agreement is 9 pages long, and it's very vague on detail. Points to potentially infrastructure partnerships where the Victorian government may invite Chinese companies to Victoria to bid for certain projects. But it's very, very short on detail, and that is a concern as well because, the Chinese regime isn't doing it really just for fun or just out of their own good graces. They are looking for a long-term relationship, and what that could look like in future is really, I think, is really just a bigger concern.
China has been really aggressive with the rest of the world, notably from our point of view with Australia. Do you see a trade war against Australia?
I think the Morrison government, if I could maybe just start on that point, has been really clear on not mixing the two issues together. So the idea of the trade war is really, I think, was first propagated by mainstream media, and it was the label was actually put on the situation. And what we've noticed over the last week or two is that the Morrison government has been keen on keeping those two issues separate. And from our perspective, it's actually, rightfully so, because it's the communists' tactic to actually muddle the waters and bring in the different issues. So on the one hand, you have investigation for calls for investigating the virus, and on the other hand, you have these tariffs on barley and bans on meat imports. These should be inherently two different issues that should be sorted out separately. But somehow the communist regime has brought these two issues really close together, and the ambassador's comments last week or 2 weeks ago has just muddied the waters a little bit. And it's a common thing that's happened. They did this with the United States when they had the ongoing trade war there, where they would often they would often try to engage for that, and Western governments would try to just keep the issues very separate, and as they should be. Another point we'd like to make about the trade war, if China decides to engage in this sort of tit-for-tat behavior, is we have to look at the communist regime at the moment, especially post-virus. At the moment, the communist regime isn't really in a position to sustain any sort of long-term economic sanctions or economic tensions with major providers or major trade partners. Its consumer spending is weak, and it doesn't have the same amount of money it just doesn't have the economic strength to engage in widespread infrastructure projects that pushed it through the global financial crisis in 2008. This time the situation is much different, and the Chinese regime, although it looks strong on the one, in just at the moment, it's still it is looking to be in a much weaker position than it was, say, 10 years ago.
The Epoch Times, Daniel, has an article about the CCP's virus propaganda, I think by Bowen Zhao, if I got his name right. Can you tell us what's going on here and how they're exploiting various forms of media, including traditional media and social media?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a book that's worth looking into called Unrestricted Warfare. And it was written by two Chinese generals from the People's Liberation Army. And the concept of it was really that rather than engage in traditional warfare with, say, other countries or rivals, the Chinese regime would use unconventional warfare or unrestricted warfare, and that would be the utilization of multiple channels to really, say, defeat a rival nation. And what we're seeing, one strand of that idea is what we're seeing now with the influence being pushed through traditional media and the social media channels that we're seeing. And just in addition to what Bowen wrote, what's not really well known is a major conglomerate called Tencent. It's a digital conglomerate, one of the largest in China. Yeah.
They run Zoom. And last year they bought 10% of Reddit, the online forum. And it was for some, like $200 million US. And you have to wonder what they're actually doing. What is their interest in buying a 10% stake in an online discussion forum? And so our perspective is, long term, there is a play there to gain access or access to information on users on Reddit. So when you look at it,
it's not just on their own social media platforms or through traditional media. It's actually, they've been buying up stakes of digital companies all around the world. Recently, Tencent bought 10% of Afterpay in Melbourne. And you have to wonder, what sort of relationships or what sort of partnerships could be occurring out of that.
Also, the access to private information. I mean, if you're with Afterpay, you've given just about everything that's known about you that's not known about you, and then China knows about you.
Absolutely. And what's also interesting is Afterpay has a very young demographic, millennials. And it's a similar thing with Reddit as well. So it just does seem to be like this digital push also in some ways an outreach to that younger demographic, and which realistically is the future of many countries as well.
It's really interesting. You see the media, and I'm very critical of the media because most of it is from, they're somewhat left, to say the least. And, sometimes you wonder about their research. Not sometimes, most times you wonder about the research. It's Twitter or it's from the social media, Reddit, for example. So all of a sudden they're getting their information not only from their information department for China, they're getting it from which they think the Western ideas that have been, that have just been mingling out into the stratosphere from everyday Americans or everyday Australians or everyday people. And in fact, it's just another arm of the Chinese propaganda unit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we found when we started the media 20 years ago was a lot of mainstream media was sourcing directly from the Chinese. Well, back then it was called the propaganda department, and it's actually quite a name, isn't it?
That's great.
It really hide its intentions.
You always call it what it is. I mean, that's what it is.
Exactly, and information on a lot of news reports was sourcing statistics, figures from the propaganda department, and regarding issues such as, maybe natural disasters, human rights issues, the Sichuan earthquake. So the Sichuan earthquake in 2008, there was a lot of the information that the West was reporting was actually just being sourced directly from the propaganda department, and they definitely had an interest in portraying the rescue efforts around the Sichuan earthquake in a very particular light.
Australia has a good relationship with China so far, and it's been very beneficial to both sides. Should the nature of the relationship change to protect Australia from over-dependence?
Yes, certainly. And we've seen the calls for decoupling from China have been very strong in the past 1 or 2 months, especially in light of the fallout from the virus outbreak and the Chinese ambassador's response to our Prime Minister's calls for an investigation into the origins of the virus. So Australia, obviously, as a media, we just seek to report. However, it's definitely in Australia's interest to stand up for its own values. Now, regarding trade, I think there's one thing to really distinguish is that at the end of the day, we always are at pains to emphasize the difference between Chinese people and the communist regime. And the Chinese people, whether they're in China, around the world, or in Australia, the 1.3 million Chinese living in Australia who identify as having that ethnicity, they're hardworking people and definitely should enjoy the trade benefits. The Chinese communist regime, however, has sort of latched on to that and has really sought to build and to strengthen its hold over the country by leveraging the hard work of the Chinese people. And I think it was Clive Hamilton who said in his book a few years ago that it was only when the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, lifted its foot off the neck of the Chinese people and allowed them some basic economic rights that the Chinese people actually started to lift the country from poverty. And we definitely, and certainly we think that. And actually, it's quite interesting when we talk about the innovation of the Chinese people. I'm of Malaysian Chinese descent, and Malaysia's largest bank, Maybank, was actually founded. When you look back, 100 years ago, was founded by a Chinese person who migrated to Malaysia.
Mm. Yeah. Amazing.
And yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking before China is known for playing the long game. Do you think the long game has got a bit shorter of late?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of summarizing it. And if anything, we'd say that the mask has fallen off the facade of the Chinese regime in recent weeks. It hasn't really changed in terms of its values, and you'd only need to dig into the human rights abuses and issues that have happened over the last 20 or 30 years when China's regime was actually growing in prominence and economic strength. Despite the advances in technology, the advances in wealth and wealth generation in China, the human rights abuses, if anything, were getting worse. But they were just becoming more attuned to covering it up and not letting people know what was going on. And advances in technology, artificial intelligence, have also made it a little bit more sophisticated in the ways they've been able to cover up certain issues. At the moment, we're writing about something, well, from an Australian perspective, TikTok. You've heard of TikTok?
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when TikTok is built on, I think they say it's unique in that it's almost built entirely around artificial intelligence, developed from China. Uh-huh. And it's actually got a very, very strong following amongst younger generation Australians. So apparently Generation Alpha, who were born after 2005, I think. They're about 20% of Generation Alpha in Australia are currently using TikTok. And so the Chinese regime, its behavior has never, its true self has never really changed. It's just that it's been using technology to mask and change the way and become more sophisticated in how it's approached its influence campaigns.
Daniel Teng, Director of the Epoch Times, thank you very much.
You're welcome, and hope to see you soon.